There once was a man who lived in India. His name was Mohandas Gandhi, but affectionately called Mahatma Gandhi, which gave him a little bit of significance of divinity to many of the Hindus. And he was a very prominent leader in the earlier part of the 20th century who led a social movement that is just beyond comparison to many things to what's happened in our world, where he was able to peacefully lead to the separation of Pakistan from India, as well as to encourage the British to leave India without war. Now, having said that, I feel like that I've just our jaws should drop that somebody could do this peacefully. What's amazing about this is that Gandhi did this using principles of Christianity to do it, in particular the Beatitudes and some of the teachings of Christ, where it was rooted in loving your enemy. He wanted to lead a revolution through love. Interestingly enough, this happened again a few years later in our country with Martin Luther King, who followed the movements of Gandhi and thought we could do that in our country as well. Interestingly enough, has been replicated again, and it's going on right now. One of the most amazing things happening in the world right now is happening in the country of Myanmar, in Burma, where a lady who's been in house arrest for over 20 years is about to be voted president of that country. And the military regime has basically laid down their guns. Time and time again, the people would begin to rise up against the armies, and she would say, no guns, no war, don't fight. And so it's amazing what people do when they implement Christian teachings into their life. Whether they're Christian or not is what's amazing to me about that. Did y'all catch that? When you implement Christian teachings into your life, it has a fundamental change on the world around us. Now, this is the concept that's important. Now, let me give a negative comment, and then we'll continue forward. Here's something that Gandhi also said that sort of just hurts. He said, I like Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. Now, that was a really powerful statement for him to say, too, and sometimes there's a lot of truth to it. And one of the reasons that I say it to you now is because we in the Restoration Movement, wanting to restore biblical principles, wanting to do what Jesus would do, this is really potent for us because we can so quickly cut through so much of church history and say, all right, let's do what the Christians did in the first century. Let's do what Christ did. And so, my topic today, my actual topic has to do with developing healthy relationships with colleagues and friends and co-workers and the people that you associate with. Last week, if you were in chapel, you got to hear the negative approach, the scare tactics, okay, and dealing with all of the potential realities you could be in that you just don't want to be in if you're not careful. This week, I'm going to try to give the positive side of it and learning how to structure your life in a Christian way so that you don't fall guilty of what Gandhi said about Christians. And I want to do this by, I'm going to sort of hop around, move in here and there, but I want us to start with Galatians chapter 5. And in Galatians chapter 5, I'm going to ask someone who wants to read in just a moment to read verses 22 through verse 25. Galatians 5, 22 through 25. And I want us to look at this passage dealing with the fruits of the Spirit and see what we can learn from it. Now, who wants to read?
I will.
Okay.
Right now?
Yeah.
I thought sometime in the near future. Galatians 5,
Yep.
and starting with,
22 through 25.
but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit.
Now, I'd like to influence the way you think about the Spirit just a little bit. I would love to help our churches almost completely demystify the Spirit as this completely unknown entity that we have no control over, where we can be Spirit-filled or not Spirit-filled, and we just don't know when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen. The reason I say that is because that's the way I just described it is not the way Paul actually talks about it. In fact, if you look over in chapter 3, the first few verses, Paul talks about them being fed with the Spirit as if they're taking food. This word Spirit's interesting if you think about it, because it's the same word as air, wind. I want you to think about the impact that air has upon your body. You breathe air in, it oxygenates your blood, helps you to think well, helps you to move, keeps you alive, gives you voice. It's a necessary part of functioning in the daily life. And so, when Paul talks about being fed with the Spirit, getting this nutrition that your body needs, it's almost like in chapter 5, he says, if you have the Spirit within you, life in you, these are some of the elements that are going to show up. Now, the reason we started out by singing Amazing Grace is because what I'm saying to you is supposed to help us swing away from Amazing Grace. What do you mean by that, Jeremy? Grace is amazing. When we talk about that song, we talk about what a tremendous sinner the author of that song was. And when he discovered grace, it was the most profound thing that had ever happened, etc., etc. Now, that's a wonderful story. I thoroughly appreciate that story because it is a huge and pivotal moment in your life when you realize that you are failing, when you're not meeting the expectations of God, and you know you can't do anything about it. That's a really big moment. But that's not all there is to it. A lot of people discover grace, and they discover grace because life continues to cycle more and more out of control. But what they don't discover is the Spirit. They don't discover that God actually wants to make their life better. In the same way I was talking about what Gandhi did in India, when you implement Christian principles in your life, you feed on the Spirit, then your life automatically begins to be better. Have you ever thought about that? And God really wants you to experience that. God just hates to see people wallowing in sin. He's happy when they discover grace, but He hates to see people discovering grace and wallowing in sin. He likes to see people actually grow and realize to the full potential of what God desired for them to be, what He desired humans to be. And so this is why a passage like this becomes so pivotal. Now look down at verse 25. If we live by the Spirit, even we should walk according to the Spirit, or something along those lines. What's interesting about this word is there are different words for walk in Scripture. One of the words for walk is just like you would think, walk. You know, and that shows up commonly. This is not that word here. This is actually a word that means get in line. It's like a military word. Get in line, get structured, get in order. It's not just a military word, but it's also a word that is used in reference to the universe and all of the elements. In what way? Well, if you started talking about a molecule, you might talk about oxygen is structured in a particular way. You understand what I'm saying? You've got I can't really tell you about a water molecule. You've got hydrogen here, oxygen here, hydrogen. It has to be done a certain way, a certain structure. And if it goes through a chemical reaction, it fundamentally changes. You still understand what I'm saying? The molecules change. And when he says, walk according to the Spirit, he says, fundamentally become restructured. Get in line. And the implications are, when you become Christians, that not only do you discover the grace of God, but you discover that dying on the cross with Jesus is something that completely and fundamentally changes the chemical makeup of who you are. That is what God intended to happen. There's another word we have for this: transformation. Metamorphosis. All, the butterfly effect. And I'm not talking about the chaos theory. I'm talking about going from worm to butterfly, okay? There's a transformation that God intends for Christians to experience. So, I'm saying all of this to help us understand that God always has intended for us to be structured a certain way. I'm convinced that when Paul talks about what Christ did for us, that Paul firmly believed that the entire universe changed structure when Christ died and was resurrected. And in the same way, when we get on the cross with Christ, that we begin to be restructured. We become changed. And he wants to see that progress continue to grow. As a very practical note, I was trying to decide how to deal with this chapel day. There's two ways to deal with it. One is very theoretical and the other one is very practical. And I have a great appreciation for both. For instance, we talked about some of those things last week, such as when you counsel people in ministry, leave your door open. When I said if you're a huggy person, don't be. I don't know if you remember that. Okay. It's just not a good idea in general unless it's your mother or your brother. And it's okay. So those are some very practical things you can do. And there's a whole list of things, and I hope you're learning those practical things to do. But I wanted to approach this one in a more theoretical way as we think about what God desires of us. Now, if you look at these actual fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, the good thing about this is you can get real practical about this too. You could sit down on a weekly basis and go through every one of these and ask, are these showing up in my life? Am I a loving person? Am I a patient person? If you want to be really challenging, you could run that list by a few people. You'll need to get to know them. Because the first time you give it to them, it's not like they're going to look at you and say, you're the most unloving person I've been. But you need somebody who can kindly look at you and say, maybe you could try this or that. And that will be a benefit to you. It would begin to let you know where you're lacking. And the reason, in general, I'm very concerned that we learn to appreciate how to grow in Christ. That's true. But let me apply it specifically to our topic. One of the problems that shows up in ministry most often is, first of all, we're not attempting holistically to develop fruits of the Spirit and move away from those sins that plague our life. We're not balanced. We're not able to establish firm borders in all of the areas of our life that we need. And we have different imbalances, and sometimes when we're good at one thing, that actually helps us become worse at other things because we like doing that thing we're good at over and over again, which causes us to neglect other areas. So I've given you a little handout here. I don't know if everybody got it. I hope you did. This is something I got out of a book that I got here in this library. It's a book dealing with counseling with particular types of personality disorders and whatnot. But if you look at this, I can give you the full reference if you want it later. If you look at this sort of lays out different types of boundary issues that people have. On the one hand, on the far left, you have excessive guilt. On the other hand, you don't have any guilt at all. You just blame others for everything. Or there's selfishness on the one hand, and then on the other extreme is caring for others. If you keep going down, professional apathy versus conscientious at work. Compulsive eating versus compulsive dieting. Fear of intimacy is contrasted with over-involvement with others. Fear of taking action is contrasted with impulsivity. And that gets you all the way around the circle. Now most people, if you take all of these particular issues, you fit somewhere on here. And you're probably not dead center on all of them. Okay? But this is sort of a way of being able to engage the way that you're able to establish certain boundaries that you have to deal with on a daily basis. And you may do better at one and worse at another. And the goal is not to be on the left or the right. The goal is to be in the center of this chart, just to make sure you understand that. Because all of these things, when they become extremes, they get us out of balance. This is just an example of how your life might reflect in how you deal with these issues. But it also, you can also see similar type issues in the way you deal with other people as well. That actually could show up in your personality that maybe you don't know how to establish those boundaries with other people. Now, I've given you several things to think about here today. One way of dealing with this is taking a chart like this and going home and saying, all right, let me take a look at this and See sort of how I fit my boundaries. How am I talking to people? How am I dealing with myself and my own strengths and weaknesses? How's my self-control? Or you could handle this a totally different way and use the fruits of the Spirit and the works of the flesh. And go down those lists and say, how am I dealing with these things? The reason that I'm dealing with it this way is while you do need to learn techniques for how to deal with issues. For instance, leaving your door open if you're counseling someone of the opposite sex. That's a good technique, but that won't actually help you fix a problem you might have. Did y'all get that? Now, the question is, well, why are you leaving your door open? Well, you want to, you're fleeing from the appearance of evil. You don't want anything bad to happen. Or are you leaving your door open because you have temptations you don't know how to deal with? It goes both ways. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, leaving the door open still helps you with the problem, but it doesn't fix the problem. Because you may be able to figure out the gimmick when it has to do with the door, but it may creep up somewhere else in your life. And that happens a lot of times where people establish these certain practical principles, but they never actually get to the root cause of the problem. They never sit down and think about it enough to figure out, well, why is this an issue? Why do I need to do this? And this shows up all the time. And it's important that you start thinking about the root causes, because buildings change, technology changes, people change, and it's actually more difficult to figure out how to keep up with the gimmicks that you've come up with. You get what I'm saying? Let's say that your struggle is with internet pornography or something like that. Well, what happened when iPhones came out? All of a sudden, now the internet's in your hand. Were you equipped to deal with that? At first it was, okay, I won't go to my computer, after such and such time at night, or I'll only get on the computer when other people, you see what I'm saying? You sort of establish these rules. But what happens is that now you have the computer in your pocket all the time. How do you deal with those same issues that came up? So what I'm encouraging you to do is not only develop some routines and habits, effective habits to dealing with sin issues or problems that might come up in your life. I'm also encouraging you to spend some time thinking about what the root issue is that you're having a struggle with, or where your problems show up, and begin to try to deal with those things as well. Now, we actually have just a few minutes left before we close, and I thought I would give just 3 to 5 minutes for any type of feedback, thoughts that you might have about any of these things.
Can I give an illustration? Basically what you're talking about.
Can I close with that?
Yeah. Can I give an illustration?
I need a good story today.
Well, this just happened, and really what you talked about last Tuesday got me thinking. And when you talk about balance, this is balance, because, well, let me give the illustration that you're talking about. My wife's been out of town for 4 days. And so I'm trying to trim the hedges and get the house looking good, so when she comes back, she'll be proud of me and know that I didn't just sit on the couch. So as I'm doing this, a lady comes up through my yard in a black slip, and that's it. And she's walking through my yard crying. The Christian in me wants to reach out to her. The Christian in me wants me to go help her. But as I get up to go help her, I stop and I think, wait just a minute. I'm here by myself. I'm outside. Mm-hmm. If somebody comes by, they're going to see the preacher with a lady in a slip out in the yard. So I know, Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these, and give them water and feed them and this, and this. But I also know that the devil might have sent this woman, because here I am by myself at my house, and I am a preacher. I could lose my wife, my job, and my standing in the community by helping this lady. So there's that balance. Where do, everybody says, well, Jesus would have done this, and I believe he would have. He would have helped the lady, but all I could see was I was gonna lose my wife and my house and my job. So, is that sort of what you're talking about?
Right.
Okay.
I think we succeed when you're thinking about it. You're beginning to figure out how issues should be dealt with.
But see, I still don't know if I done what was right.
Well, okay, you know, if you don't mind me using this illustration here.
God might have sent it so you'd have the illustration.
Yeah.
I just wanna know if he finished the hedge.
Look at this chart here, and I would encourage someone wiser than me to respond to this too. This one fits on the. There's several of these continuums we could deal with here, but I'm going to deal with impulsivity and fear of taking action. Sometimes we're more concerned with the appearance of doing something because there's some type of image in society. For instance, how many of you have ever felt guilty by driving by somebody who's walking down the side of the road? We've got this cultural thing that if you don't stop and pick them up and help them, that you're not doing the Christian thing. Well, that's just become the most overused illustration I've ever heard in my life. You understand what I'm saying? It's not ever as simple as picking them up and taking them where they're going, as if that has fixed anything. You understand what I'm saying? Or it's the same thing with dealing with somebody, for instance, the homeless man on the street. Well, when you start putting a real actual price tag on fixing the homeless man on the street, it's $5,000, $10,000, maybe up to $40,000 of government money to actually fix that problem. So what that means is sometimes maybe you didn't fix that particular issue because you were incapable of doing it, but you're actually working on the root cause of a problem in society in very different ways. Y'all understand what I mean by that? What I'm getting at is sometimes, you haven't realized this, sometimes you can't fix problems. And just because you want to doesn't mean anything in terms of actually helping that person. You might be able to take them to the first step of fixing the problem. But sometimes you have to learn your limits. And now specifically getting back to your case, there are actually other ways, if it bothers your conscience enough for somebody to walk through your yard, there's other ways you can deal with it, such as a phone call. Call a lady in the church.
Yes.
Say, hey, can you come over here? I really need some help. That way, maybe you do help with the problem, and at the same time, you don't compromise everything that doesn't need to be compromised.
Another thing that I thought about that I'd never thought about before, if I've got my life in order and balance, that doesn't mean that she's got her life in balance. So, I mean, if I help her, she might have been, and she's in a slip and that's it.
Yeah.
And she might have said, well, you know, I want to thank you. And you know, and so,
Yeah.
normally, I believe before last Tuesday, I would have jumped up and just went ahead. But I stopped and I thought about the consequences of my actions.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason we feel guilty is sometimes a misapplication of Scripture. For instance, Jesus with the woman at the well is probably one we use, where sometimes we exploit too heavily that Jesus broke cultural norms to talk to her. Jesus did not go into a harlot's home and sit down with harlots and say, let's have a Bible study. You understand what I'm saying? They were in a public well. I don't care if it was a cultural boundary or not, but there's a difference in one or the other. Any other thoughts?
I want to know that last statement you said before Ricky readdressed everything. I'm not sure I understand all and know about what you mean.
About the helping people? Okay. I didn't get that either. Okay. You're not understanding me and I'm not understanding you. Anybody else? Well, I appreciate your feedback and your thoughts, and I hope you will spend a little more time thinking about some of these things, and I hope you'll think about yourself and your ministry. Think about the people you interact with on a very constant basis, daily, sometimes much more than daily. People you deal with weekly, how you deal with people at congregations, how you deal with each other here, and sort of try to figure out where you are on the spectrum. And figure out where you are with the fruits of the Spirit and how these things impact your life and where your borders are. Try to figure out where your borders are. And I think that will really, really bless your ministry, and it will allow you to minister for a long time if you do. Last
Jeremy?
thought, and then we'll pray.
Um,
Travis,
I don't,
prayer.
I don't think that Ricky should feel guilty because he didn't think
Yeah.
to call a sister to help. Because at the time, we all, when something's dropped on us just out of the blue and we're not really expecting it,
Mm-hmm.
we don't sort through all the options that are there. We don't have time to think about them.
Yeah.
And for what he did at the time, I would say he took the right course. If he'd thought, had a little more time to think about it,
Yeah.
then calling that sister or someone to help
Yeah.
would have been in order. But I don't think Ricky needs to feel guilty because he did absolutely nothing.
Right.
Because
Same here, and I hope I didn't imply
No,
that.
but
No, I wouldn't suggest
honestly though, it's something that I think about, I've thought about since that day, over and over and over again.
Mhm.
It'll
Because-
bother you.
Because right then and there,
Mhm.
my ministry could have ended.
Yeah.
And me not done anything other than tried to help somebody.
Right.
And I had never stopped and thought that thought before,
Right.
because it would just been in me to help them.
Right.
But I sat back down, I never did really tell you what I'd done, but I sat back down and finished trimming the rose bush.
Yeah.
Because by the time I'd have called somebody, she'd been out of sight anyway. I mean, she was walking pretty fast.
Mhm.
And, but, I think that that's something that we do need to question ourselves on. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I think your whole thing was about,
Right.
was what we should do in this situation and how we should handle ourselves.
Right. Right. Very helpful.